Today you will hear the testimony of Amina Lawal, a young Christian woman from Nigeria who was taken from her own home in the middle of the night, handcuffed and brought along with 17 other brothers and sisters in faith to a place where death seemed certain. The sound of chains striking metal, the screams in the dark, and the cold stare of the soldiers turned that day into a living nightmare. But no one could have imagined what was about to happen inside that prison. Hearts of stone would be broken, and even the enemies would kneel before the power of an invisible God. This is not just a testimony, it is a collision of faith, courage, and miracle in the midst of darkness. And to begin, make sure you are subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you.
When the truck stopped and the doors opened, a heavy air took over me. The sound of chains dragging across the concrete floor echoed like a lament. We were pushed into a place that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. The ground was covered with a mixture of mud, rust, and dried blood. The smell was strong, almost impossible to breathe. The walls, damp and cracked, reflected a dim yellow light that trembled from a worn-out wire hanging from the ceiling. At that moment, I realized that hell could have many forms, and that was one of them. The chains around my neck were thick, cold, alive. Every movement made the iron tear a bit of my skin and, at the same time, hurt whoever was chained beside me. It was a cruel system. If I tried to move to ease the pain, I caused pain in someone else. I remember the sound of the metal grinding, the weight on my shoulders, and the constant feeling of not being able to breathe properly. There were men and women of different ages, all tired, dirty, but with something in common: the empty look of those who knew they might never see the sun again. Among us was Pastor Cheek Obi, a man about 60 years old, with a supernatural calmness that unsettled me. He was the kind of person who seemed born with an unshakable faith, the kind of faith that unsettles fear. Even in that darkness, his voice sounded like shelter. Beside him, young Yusuf, 17 years old, trembled so much he could barely keep his head up. He was new in the faith, yet he tried to whisper verses he remembered, as if each word were an attempt to cling to hope. For a while, no one said a word, only the sound of chains, heavy breathing, and, from time to time, a distant scream coming from another corridor. Those screams felt like they came from inside me, as if I knew them. Fear was almost tangible. It mixed with the air, seeped through the skin, and paralyzed the body. I remember looking at my hands and seeing them shaking uncontrollably. I tried to pray, but nothing came out. Not a single word. It felt as if heaven was closed and God had gone silent. Then, without even realizing it, I began to murmur softly a hymn we used to sing at our secret gatherings. It was a simple song, but it always made me feel that God was near. The melody escaped my lips with almost no strength, but it found an echo. A weak voice joined in, then another, and suddenly the whole cell was whispering together. It wasn't a beautiful song. It was hoarse, broken, almost wept, but it was alive. For the first time since we had been taken, we felt that we were still human. I could hear the guard outside striking his baton against the wall as if trying to silence us. But no one stopped. The fear didn't disappear. It just became smaller than faith. As we sang, something began to change. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of fear had dissolved for a moment. When we finished, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It was a silence full of meaning, a silence that spoke. The hours that followed were slow torment. The cold seeped through the stones and climbed up our legs, freezing the soul. At every sound of footsteps in the corridor, my heart raced. I thought of my mother, of the small room where we used to pray, and wondered if she was still alive, if she knew where I was. Pastor Chike would close his eyes from time to time and murmur something that sounded like an intimate conversation with God. Yusuf, the youngest, cried without sound, his shoulders shaking, his face turned to the ground. Suddenly, we heard the heavy creak of the iron door. A guard appeared and shouted something in Hausa that none of us really understood, but the tone was clear. At dawn, we would be taken to the yard. He didn't need to explain why. Everyone knew. I felt my stomach twist and my legs weaken. I tried not to cry, but the tears came on their own, warm, silent. That's when I asked myself, with my voice stuck in my throat, is God still here? And it was exactly at that moment that something changed. There was no wind, no light, no sound, only a feeling, a gentle, invisible warmth passing through the cold air. It was as if fear had lost its power. The tears kept falling, but now they came with something else. Peace. I looked at Pastor Cheek, and he was smiling. A calm smile, impossible to explain. Yusuf lifted his eyes and his lips trembled as he whispered, "He is here." I don't know how to describe what happened next. It was as if a soft presence had spread through the cell, touching each of us. The pain remained, the cold remained, but inside me there was something new, certainty. We were not alone, and even if no one else believed, even if the whole world had forgotten us, there inside that basement forgotten by humanity, God was still present. The night passed slowly, and when the first ray of sunlight pierced through the cracks in the wall, I felt my heart race again. The sound of boots echoed through the corridors like the announcement of a sentence. The guards' shouts ordering us to stand broke the silence. The doors opened with a creak that sounded like an axe splitting wood. The man who entered was tall, with a hard expression and cold eyes. I recognized him, Colonel Musa Ibrahim, the same one who had accused us of treason. He held a clipboard and read in a metallic, emotionless voice, "Whoever denies Jesus will live. Whoever insists on following him will die now." The words hung in the air like a blade about to fall. The first to be called was Mama Ruth, an elderly woman who could barely hold her head up. She took a deep breath and replied in a trembling voice, "I cannot deny the one who saved me." The colonel observed her expressionlessly and moved on to the next. Each answer was a sentence, each name called felt like a blow, until it was Yusuf's turn. He was pale, his face swollen from crying, but when he looked at the colonel, something changed in his gaze. Suddenly, his voice came out firm, as if from a place higher than fear. "Jesus is alive!" The sound of the impact was immediate. The colonel raised his rifle and struck him hard in the face. The metallic sound echoed and blood flowed, but Yusuf didn't fall. He stood there, his gaze fixed, and that made something inside me awaken. When it was my turn, I felt my whole body freeze. The colonel approached, staring at me with disdain and a certain curiosity. "You're young. You still have a life ahead of you. Just say that your Christ is an illusion, and I'll let you go." For a moment, I thought of everything I could lose, my family, my home, my life. The voice inside me said, "Just one word." But the silence that followed was greater than the fear. I remembered the hymn, the hidden prayers, the love that had sustained me until then. I took a deep breath and answered, almost whispering, but with every fiber of my soul, "He is more real than the air you are breathing." Time stood still. The sound faded. The colonel stared at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger. It was doubt. He took a step back, looked at the soldiers, and ordered them to proceed. No one spoke. Only the sound of chains dragging back into the courtyard. As we walked, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. At first I thought it was fear, but the confused looks on the guards' faces suggested otherwise. The walls vibrated slightly, as if something were awakening within the earth. The colonel looked around, tense, trying to hide his discomfort. And then came the first snap, metallic, sharp, as if a chain were being forced from within. I looked to the side and saw Pastor Cheek with wide eyes. One of the chains that bound a woman's neck had snapped open on its own. None of us believed it. The colonel shouted something in fury, but he had barely finished speaking when another crack echoed. Another chain broke free, then another. The sound multiplied across the courtyard like a metallic chorus of freedom. The chains fell, one by one, heavy, freeing each body, and the ground filled with the sound of the impossible. The colonel yelled for us to stop, accusing us of trickery, but the soldiers were terrified. One of them dropped his rifle, another took a step back, his eyes wide. I felt the cold iron slip from my neck and fall to the ground with a dry sound. I touched my skin, it was clean, without any marks. Clouds formed rapidly in the sky, dark as if the earth and sky were witnessing it together. The colonel raised his voice once more, trying to maintain control, but he couldn't. The tremor continued. The ground seemed to pulse, and it was at that moment that something gleamed beside my foot. It was the small crucifix I had seen at the beginning, hidden in the uniform of one of the soldiers. It had fallen and, upon touching the ground, shone with a soft light. The soldier looked at it, and tears began to fall from his eyes. He murmured, his voice choked with emotion, looking at us. "He's here." And in that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. When that crucifix gleamed on the ground, a profound silence filled the entire courtyard. It was as if the air had stopped circulating, as if time had been suspended by an invisible force. None of us moved, no soldier dared to breathe any louder. I could only hear my own heart, beating so hard it felt like it wanted to burst from my chest. Colonel Musa, the man who, minutes before, had shouted orders in an iron voice, was now pale, his eyes fixed on the chains scattered across the ground, as if the impossible had just torn the world apart before him. He tried to shout, to open his mouth, to say something, but no voice came out, only a hoarse, stifled sound. And then it happened. The sound of falling metal was replaced by another sound, the sound of weeping. The colonel dropped his sword. It fell with a dry crack onto the stone floor and rolled to a stop in front of one of the soldiers. He took a step back, startled, as if the weapon itself had condemned him. The colonel looked up at the sky. His shoulders began to tremble, and suddenly that ruthless man, the same one who had condemned us, the same one who had called us traitors, fell to his knees. The scene was so improbable that none of us could react. The one who had once represented the supreme authority of violence was now there, prostrate, his hands covering his face and tears streaming down his fingers. For a few seconds the entire courtyard stood still. It was as if even the wind was watching. And then one of the guards, the same one who had dropped his rifle, began to mutter, first in a low voice, then louder. I saw it with my own eyes. God is here. His words pierced the air and shattered the remaining fear. One by one, other soldiers began to kneel. Some wept without understanding what they were feeling. Others gazed silently at the sky, as if awaiting an explanation that would never come. I watched with teary eyes, my heart pounding within me. It was then that a courage I didn't know I possessed made me step forward. The chains were at my feet and the ground still trembled slightly. I raised my hands and, without thinking, began to pray aloud. My voice was weak at first, but soon gained strength. Lord, if you are here, touch their hearts as you touched ours. show them the same love that made us endure until the end. The sound of my own words frightened me, but I couldn't stop. It was as if I was being used to say something that didn't just come from me. And then, in that instant, a light pierced the clouds. The sun, which had been hidden until then, broke through the sky with a golden glow that covered the entire courtyard. The air felt different, warm, almost sacred. The prisoners began to sing the same hymn from the previous night again, but this time there was no fear in their voices. It was a song of freedom, a praise that rose with force and broke the silence of the place that had previously symbolized death. The soldiers, kneeling, looked at us with eyes full of tears. Some repeated parts of the song without understanding the language, moved only by emotion. The colonel was still on the ground, breathing heavily, his head bowed. When he lifted his face, I could see the transformation. He was no longer the same man. There was something different in his gaze, a mixture of shame, relief, and something new, faith. He looked at me, tears still streaming down his dust-covered face, and in a trembling voice said, "I never believed in anything until today." Those words pierced my heart like a sword, but a sword of light, not of pain. I knew that, at that moment, I wasn't just a Nigerian colonel kneeling before prisoners. I was a man encountering God for the first time. The hymn continued. The voices echoed off the prison walls, and suddenly something happened that none of us would ever forget. Without anyone's command, without the sound of a gear or key, the gates began to move. Slowly, heavily, creaking as if the iron itself resisted what was happening. But they opened. The sound was unmistakable. Freedom. The soldiers stood up, but did not draw their weapons. Some were still crying, others trembling. I watched each of them as one witnesses a miracle in motion. Colonel Musa stood, looked at the open gate, and then at us. "Go," he said in a hoarse voice. "You are free." But no one moved immediately. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. That place, which minutes before had been the scene of our condemnation, now became an altar. The soldiers approached slowly, many with red faces and teary eyes. One of them, a young man who must have been barely older than me, knelt before me and spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "How can I get to know this Jesus?" I felt my chest tighten, a lump in my throat. I smiled and replied, "He's already calling you. You just need to say yes." He lowered his head and began to cry again. We walked slowly toward the exit. No guard raised his rifle. None touched us. On the contrary, they made way. It was as if we were crossing the sea that had parted before the people of Israel. With each step, I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet, as if the earth itself recognized the power that had manifested itself there. Outside, the sun shone with a different intensity. The air felt fresh. The city, accustomed to the sound of weapons and fear, was now silent. People began to emerge from their houses, one by one, watching in shock as that group of prisoners walked out with their heads held high, accompanied by the very soldiers who had previously taken them by force. I saw frightened faces, others incredulous. No one could understand what was happening. An old man standing on the corner made the sign of the cross. A woman covered her face with her hands. Children watched curiously, clinging to their mothers' skirts. It was as if the entire city was witnessing a mystery, the impossible unfolding before their eyes. Colonel Musa walked beside me in silence. From time to time he looked up at the sky and shook his head, still trying to comprehend. I could see he was internally struggling between shame and gratitude. He had been the instrument of our suffering, and now he was a witness to our liberation. When we reached the large iron gate that separated the courtyard from the street, he stopped. He stood there motionless, observing the people in the distance. And then he said to me, "I want to see where you all meet. I want to understand what happened here." I was speechless for a few seconds. Those words were living proof that the Spirit of God had broken through the walls, the fear, and the hatred. I smiled and simply replied, "We'll show you." As we walked along the dirt road, I looked back and saw the prison walls getting smaller and smaller. The same gate that had once separated us from life was now wide open. Some soldiers came behind us, still dazed. Others remained there, kneeling, looking at the sky as if waiting for a new order that would never come. Pastor Chike walked ahead, leaning on Yusuf, the young man who still bore the marks on his face from the blow he had received. And even with the dried blood there, he smiled. He smiled as if he no longer felt any pain. The sun shone on his face and made the iron of the fallen chains gleam, scattered along the path as witnesses to the miracle. Each step we took seemed like a reminder that faith isn't limited to words. It manifests itself when there's no more human strength, when everything seems lost, and yet the heart chooses to trust. I felt it vibrating within me. It was as if something inside me had been broken and rebuilt in the same instant. When we finally left the prison walls, the sounds of the city began to return, footsteps, voices, birds. But there was something different. That was the sound of freedom, and not just physical freedom, but spiritual freedom. The soldiers walked with us in silence, their uniforms unraised, their weapons unarmed. Just men and women, now equals, trying to understand what they had just experienced. I looked at Colonel Musa. He was holding tightly the crucifix that had previously fallen from his soldier. He observed it with reverence, as if it were the first time he had seen something sacred. His lips moved silently. I didn't know if he was praying, but deep down I was sure he was. When we reached the end of the street, a crowd began to gather. People whispered, pointed, some knelt. There was fear, but also admiration. The sun, now high, reflected off the iron chains the soldiers carried on their arms, as if they wanted to remember that day forever. I looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. The air felt light. It was as if every particle in the environment had been purified. And in that moment, I understood that we weren't just free, we were being sent forth. Something inside me told me that this miracle wouldn't end there, but the colonel still had a distant look, lost in thought. He walked slowly, like someone carrying an invisible burden. When the wind blew strongly, raising dust from the road, he stopped and looked at me with teary eyes. "Amina," he said, his voice breaking, "I need to understand what I saw." I looked at him and calmly replied, "You don't need to understand, Colonel. You just need to believe." The wind passed again, and for a moment I would have sworn I heard an echo, the same sound of falling iron, the same crack of freedom. It was as if God had left a reminder in the air, a silent message for all of us. Nothing, absolutely nothing, can hold back what He decides to set free. But I knew that journey wasn't over yet. Something inside me told me that, although we were free, a new spiritual battle was only beginning. And that awareness pulsed deep in my chest as we continued walking towards the unknown. That night seemed to carry within it the weight of the world and at the same time the lightness of the sky. The sun had hidden behind the hills of Kaduna, and the hot Nigerian air was beginning to give way to a cool breeze that entered through the cracks of the small house where we gathered. It was a simple house, made of mud and wood, the kind of place that could barely hold so many people, but which that night seemed to expand with the presence of something divine. Inside, The sound of footsteps was replaced by whispers, sobs, and prayers. Seated around a makeshift table of planks and blocks, former prisoners and soldiers shared the same space, the same bread, and the same reverent silence. I sat by the window, watching the shadows move in the dim lamplight. Before me, Colonel Musa, the same man who, hours before, had condemned so many of us, now seemed different. He looked at his own hands as if trying to understand how they could have done so much harm, and yet now trembled before grace. Pastor Chike stood beside him, an open Bible on his lap. Yusuf, the young man with the intense gaze, kept his head bowed, his face still scarred but serene, as if physical pain no longer mattered. The silence was broken when the colonel took a deep breath, rested his elbows on his knees, and spoke in a hoarse, heavy, but sincere voice. "I learned to kill. That's what I was taught from a young age. Obedience, power, fear. But today," he paused, his eyes welling up with tears, "today I saw the power that gives life." Those words fell upon us like rain on dry land. No one answered. There was no need. He rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground, and then knelt. But this time it was not an act of surrender to a greater force or to an enemy. It was a gesture of faith. A man hardened by war, now broken by the love of God. The lamp flickered in the wind, and Pastor Chike closed his eyes, murmuring a prayer. I saw one of the soldiers, the same one who had knocked the crucifix down in the courtyard, take something from his pocket and walk over to me. It was an old, worn Bible with burnt edges. He held it in both hands and, in a trembling voice, said, "It belonged to my father. He was imprisoned years ago because of his faith. I kept it, hid it, but I never had the courage to open it. I think now it belongs to you." For a moment, my hands hesitated to receive it. I touched it carefully, smelling the scent of the old paper, and something inside me stirred. It seemed that this Bible had waited for me, traversed time, fear, and blood, just to arrive at this moment. The soldiers began to tell their stories, men trained to obey, to destroy, confessing between sobs that for years they had felt an emptiness growing inside. One of them said, "I always thought faith was for the weak, but today when I saw those chains falling, I realized that I was the one who was chained." Those words made everyone cry, sincere, liberating tears. It was a cry born not of guilt, but of relief, of rediscovering something they didn't even know still existed. I was watching Colonel Musa. He was different. The arrogance had vanished from his face. In its place, there was humility. When he stood up again, he placed his hand on his chest and said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, nor God's." Pastor Chike stood up slowly, leaning on Yusuf, and replied in a firm voice, "None of us deserve it. That's why it's called grace." At that moment, the colonel cried like a child, and we cried with him. As time went by, something began to change inside me. It was as if, even after all the liberation, there was still a shadow lingering. I felt peace, but also a weight, a kind of unease that I couldn't explain. I knew the miracle had been real, but I also knew that the world outside remained the same, harsh, merciless, and ready to silence anyone who dared to speak the name of Jesus aloud. The tea was served in metal mugs. The bread was passed from hand to hand. Each bite seemed like a celebration, a sacrament of the new life we had received. Outside, the wind howled and the sky was clear and starry. The city slept, unaware that there, in that small house, something supernatural was happening, something that would forever change all of our lives. The colonel looked at me and said in a low voice, almost a whisper, I'm going to be hunted down for this. The government won't forgive me. I replied calmly, The Lord has already forgiven you. And that's what matters. He nodded, took a deep breath, and murmured, So I'd rather die free than live a prisoner of lies. Those words pierced me like fire. I knew he was right. The real challenge wasn't surviving prison, it was continuing to believe outside of it. Being a Christian in that country was like walking through a minefield, and now I realized that the real battlefield began there. During the early morning hours, while everyone slept, I got up. I went to the window and looked at the horizon. The moon illuminated the rooftops of distant houses. The silence was almost absolute, but inside me there was a turmoil. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness brought freedom, but also responsibility. And I could feel it. The enemy wouldn't give up so easily. The days began to pass. News of what had happened in the prison spread like a silent fire. People spoke of miracles, but also of blasphemy. Some said we were crazy, others that we were dangerous. Rumors traveled everywhere. The government was furious. The authorities didn't know how to contain the conversions within the army. When I finally made it back home, the path seemed different. Every stone, every tree, every familiar smell had taken on a new meaning. As I approached the door, my legs trembled. I knocked softly, and when my mother opened it, for a moment she just looked at me, unable to believe it. Then she fell to her knees, her hands covering her face, and began to cry. It was him, Amina. It could only have been him, she repeated endlessly. I knelt beside her, crying too. Her hug was the strongest I'd ever felt. It was the embrace of life rediscovering hope. But the peace didn't last long. In less than a week, rumors began to circulate. The government was hunting down the soldiers who had deserted. Many had disappeared. They said secret prisons were being reopened, and that no one who had participated in that event would be spared. With each piece of news, my heart ached. I prayed for them every night, asking God to hide them as He had hidden us that day. Even so, something inside me told me I couldn't stop. The miracle we had experienced wasn't just to be told, it was to be multiplied. I began to discreetly gather small groups in the homes of the village. We prayed, studied the Word, and sang the same hymns that had once echoed in that cell. Each meeting was an act of faith and, at the same time, a risk. One night, I woke up startled. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I felt the cold weight of the chain around my neck again. I touched my skin, and it was free. I smiled to myself in the dark and whispered, I still belong to Him. I always will. The memory of the iron was like a reminder of the power that set me free, but also a warning that the spiritual struggle never ends. The next morning, while preparing tea, I heard a noise outside. Someone was knocking on the door forcefully but subtly, as if trying not to draw attention. I went to it, my heart racing. When I opened it, I saw a familiar shadow. It was one of the soldiers who had knelt in the courtyard that day. His face was downcast, his eyes sunken. He looked around, making sure no one had followed him, and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. They're coming after you, Amina. I felt the ground disappear for a moment. The wind blew strongly, extinguishing the table lamp. The silence that followed was the same silence that precedes the storm. That warning sounded like the beginning of something bigger. I knew that the peace we had experienced wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the interval between two battles. I looked at the crucifix on the table, the same one that had gleamed on the prison floor, and felt the weight of responsibility. As the soldier walked away into the darkness, I closed the door slowly, my heart racing, my mind in prayer. Outside, his footsteps mingled with the distant sound of thunder. Inside me, a certainty pulsed. The same God who opened the prison gates would remain with me, even if the doors of fear tried to close again. That night would be long. I knew it. But I also knew that once you see the impossible happen, there's no going back to having a small faith. And even with a heavy heart, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let the silence speak for me. Because, deep down, I knew the miracle wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning.
And what an unbelievable story, isn't it? Amina Lawal saw the impossible happen before her very eyes. Chains were broken, hardened hearts surrendered, and even the man who condemned her ended up finding the God who liberates. It's living proof that when all seems lost, heaven still has the final say. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine, check if you're already subscribed to the channel. And if not, take this opportunity to subscribe, leave a like, and share this message with someone who needs to remember that God still performs miracles. And tell me in the comments, who stayed until the end and felt the presence of God? Write "and I love Jesus." That way I'll know you're part of this family of faith that grows every day. And be warned, the next video that's appearing on the screen will give you chills. In Iran, a Christian carpenter was thrown into the fire, but Jesus did this, a true, powerful, and transformative story that you need to see to the end. Click now and prepare your heart. See you there, and may God bless you mightily.